Movies have been extremely influential since day one. It makes sense. Movie watching is a communal experience. It gives big groups of people a singular topic to talk about. Most of the time, we see movies as a source of entertainment. That they are, but in some cases, they've also been sources of political change. In this video, I want to take a look at the movies that have influenced real public policy or societal change. These are the movies that stirred society's imaginations to the point that enough people got together and said we should change this, or perhaps acted as inspiration for others to enact change. None of these are documentaries either. They're all narrative features. In most cases, the changes have been for the positive, though I will leave the final judgment up to you all. One of the most important, if not the most important technology that came of age during the 20th century is the computer and all that goes into making it. It helped revolutionize how we communicate, work, and enjoy our free time, but it also opened up entirely new vectors of attack. Vectors that we hadn't thought of before, but ones that could prove to be very catastrophic. Few movies deal with just how wonderful and dangerous of a technology the computer is than 1983's WarGames. Directed by John Badham and starring Matthew Broderick, John Wood, and Ali Sheedy, the movie is about a hacker that hacks a United States military supercomputer and accidentally launches a game of global thermonuclear war that could cause actual thermonuclear war. Released during the Cold War when tensions between the United States and the USSR were at an all-time high, and when the fear of a nuclear exchange between the two countries was enough of a possibility that schools held safety drills for what to do during a nuclear attack, WarGames struck at just the right moment. With a cyber attack leading to nuclear devastation at its core, WarGames got news media talking and asking, what if? What if someone was able to hack some system somewhere and launch a nuke? What if they were able to destroy the lives of millions or tens of millions of people? What if we were just one bored teenager away from catastrophe? The movie helped lead to the inclusion of cybercrime in the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, a major revision of the U.S. Criminal Code, as well as a later amendment, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. A House committee report cited WarGames as, quote, a realistic representation of the automatic dialing and access capabilities of the personal computer, end quote. Ronald Reagan would also watch and discuss the film with members of Congress, advisors, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which, supposedly, led him to enacting NSDD 145, a national security directive that helped set guidelines on security questions that were important to the administration. Though dated in some ways, this is a movie that, I think, will always remain relevant. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, is one of the greatest movies ever made, and perhaps the greatest political satire ever committed to film. John Patterson, writing for The Guardian, captured it well, quote, there had been nothing in comedy like Dr. Strangelove ever before. All the gods before whom the Americans of the stolid, paranoid 50s had genuflected, the bomb, the Pentagon, the national security state, the president himself, Texan masculinity, and the alleged commie menace of water fluoridation, went into the wood chipper and never got the same respect ever again, end quote. That much is true. Released in 1964 when the Cold War was already in full effect, when the Cuban Missile Crisis had left the world shaken, when John F. Kennedy was already assassinated, when escalation in Vietnam was about to begin, and fears of a nuclear exchange were in the back of everybody's mind, Dr. Strangelove touched a nerve that's remained frayed ever since. Loosely adapted from Peter George's Red Alert, this was something of a joint effort. The book helped initiate change while Dr. Strangelove laid bare the scope of the issue, so much so that the US commissioned but did not release SAC Command Post, a 17-minute propaganda film that was supposed to let Americans know that actually everything was totally under control and everything you saw in Dr. Strangelove was totally fiction. One of the salient parts about the movie and the book is how ridiculously easy it would have been for anyone to start a nuclear exchange. Writing for The New Yorker, Eric Schlosser wrote that upon his presidency, Kennedy was told that, quote, a subordinate commander faced with a substantial military action could start the thermonuclear holocaust on his own initiative if he could not reach you, end quote. Schlosser noted how shocked Kennedy and his advisors were that the veritable ability to destroy the world many times over was given to so many. In Schlosser's words, quote, few of the weapons had locks on them. Anyone who got hold of them could detonate them. And there was little to prevent NATO officers from Turkey, Holland, Italy, Great Britain, and Germany from using them without the approval of the United States, end quote. Thanks to copies of Red Alert circulating around the Pentagon, though, people were beginning to take notice that maybe this was a bad idea. Schlosser continued, writing, quote, at the Pentagon, the book was taken seriously as a cautionary tale about what might go wrong. Even Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara privately worried that an accident, a mistake, or a rogue American officer could start a nuclear war, end quote. Changes began to be made. The Kennedy administration was the first to add code switches so that a nuke couldn't be launched just because somebody felt like it. Later, the two-man rule would be instituted. That meant that permission would be necessary to launch a bomb. They also instituted the Human Reliability Program to, quote, stop people with emotional, psychological, and substance abuse problems from gaining access to nuclear weapons, end quote. Frankly, it's a miracle that we're all still alive. 1983's The Day After, directed by Nicholas Meyer, along with its 1984 counterpart, Threads, are powerful films. These are not feel-good movies about how, after a nuclear disaster, we're all going to come together, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya, or worse, Imagine by John Lennon. No, these are movies that lay bare the fullness of devastation. Dave from Grand Theft Auto 5 actually captures the sentiment very well.
You are D-O-N-E fucked!
The Day After was broadcast the Sunday before Thanksgiving in 1983 and showed the breakout, then escalation of war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries. The idea that MAD, or mutually assured destruction, would act as an ultimate deterrent is nixed, as countries begin to exchange hundreds of warheads. Whoever fired first isn't certain, nor does it really matter. The power grid is destroyed. Vehicles are disabled thanks to the nuke's EMP or electromagnetic pulse. That's one of the things about nuclear bombs. The physical destruction is only one component. The EMP can travel long distances, with high-altitude blasts spanning countries, ravaging electronics all over. Then there's the fallout, the firestorms, the flash blinding, and so on. That's just what the bomb does on its own. Then there's the societal collapse, the breakdown of laws. Money is worthless, and so are orders from higher-ups. The only thing that matters now is ammo, shelter, food, and drink. That's the new currency. The only ones that are innocent in a society like this are those that can defend themselves, and the ones that are guilty are those that are too weak to defend themselves. It's not a situation you can get yourself out of after a year, or 10 years, or probably even 100 years. You would need to rebuild society from the ground up, a school system, a food network, a political and legal system. All the basic components would need to be rebuilt under severe duress. In the Day After, the president is still around, but what are they the president of? Nothing more than a charnel house. It was estimated that nearly 100 million people saw the first broadcast of The Day After, making it one of the most watched events ever. Even more impressive when you consider that the population back then was 233 million. Similar to how Strangelove got some pushback from the defense apparatus, The Day After got plenty of pushbacks from conservatives. The geniuses at the New York Post called director Nicholas Meyer a traitor, while Richard Grenier, writing for the National Review, said that the movie was quote-unquote unpatriotic. Ronald Reagan, however, did not share this viewpoint. In fact, we know exactly what he thought thanks to a diary entry dated Monday, October 10, 1983. It's worth me reading in full. Quote, Columbus Day. In the morning at Camp D. I ran the tape of the movie ABC is running on the air November 20th. It's called The Day After. It has Lawrence, Kansas wiped out in a nuclear war with Russia. It is powerfully done, all $7 million worth. It's very effective and left me greatly depressed. So far, they haven't sold any of the 25 spot ads scheduled, and I can see why. Whether it will be of help to the anti-nukes or not, I can't say. My own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent and to see there is never a nuclear war. Back to WH, end quote. He wasn't the only one. The Joint Chiefs of Staff saw it too. One of Nicholas Meyer's friends was at a screening and told Meyer that, quote, if you wanted to draw blood, you did it. Those guys sat there like they were turned to stone, end quote. The movie would have a direct impact on Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signing the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, which resulted in the banning and reduction of parts of the country's nuclear arsenals. This is a movie that I hope remains fiction. If not, I hope you're all lucky enough to not survive the initial bombing. If you do, my sympathies in advance. 1966's The Battle of Algiers, directed by Giulio Pontecorvo, is one of those movies that gets some people so much in a huff that they ban it entirely. Thus, you know it's doing something right and something people don't want you to see. It's also considered to be one of the finest movies ever made and has had a wide-ranging influence on directors like Stanley Kubrick, Steven Soderbergh, Werner Herzog, Alfonso Cuarón, and others. Of it, Kubrick said, quote, all films are, in a sense, false documentaries. One tries to approach reality as much as possible, only it's not reality. There are people who do very clever things which have completely fascinated and fooled me. For example, the Battle of Algiers. It's very impressive, end quote. The movie is about the early years of the Algerian War, which lasted 8 years and resulted in Algerian independence from France. It was one revolution in a century marked by them as the world wars left Europe ravaged and unable to maintain its empire, and dozens of countries liberated themselves, some peacefully, some not. War wounds were fresh in France, which had officially banned the movie for 1 year upon its release, but was practically banned for several more years because no distributor was willing to pick it up. Pontecorvo called the French government sensitive on the issue, saying, quote, "The Algerians put no obstacles in our way because they knew that I'd be making a more or less objective film about the subject," end quote. It wasn't just the government that was sensitive. Far-right groups threatened to bomb theaters that showed the film, while Pontecorvo received death threats. Some things apparently never change. The wimpish reaction wasn't shared by most of the well-adjusted French movie-going public, who found it nuanced and balanced. Meanwhile, Americans loved it. Anti-war protests to Vietnam were ongoing at the time of its release, and Roger Ebert captured the mood, quote, "It may be a deeper film experience than many audiences can withstand. Too cynical, too true, too cruel, and too heartbreaking. It is about the Algerian War, but those not interested in Algeria may substitute another war. The Battle of Algiers has a universal frame of reference," end quote. The political impact of the Battle of Algiers has more to do with its influence on the military in different countries. It's been screened to give soldiers an idea of what they can expect when fighting a guerrilla war. On the other side of the coin, it's been screened for guerrilla groups as a testament to what they can hope to achieve. For example, the Pentagon screened the film in September 2003 for dozens of officers and civilian experts to encourage them to discuss the film. A flyer for the event read, quote, "How to win a battle against terrorism and lose the war of ideas. Children shoot soldiers at point-blank range. Women plant bombs in cafes. Soon the entire Arab population builds to a mad fervor. Sound familiar? The French have a plan. It succeeds tactically, but fails strategically. To understand why, come to a rare showing of this film," end quote. It was obviously a prescient question considering how the war on terror actually went. Meanwhile, there was a rising tide in national liberation movements, as well as a rise in left-wing radicalism in European countries at the time. For many countries, independence would not come without violence, and those under the yoke of another would have to get creative in how they rebelled. The movie was circulated among groups like the Black Panthers, the Provisional IRA, and the PLO, and was a decided favorite of would-be revolutionaries. Journalist Jimmy Breslin described the movie as a training film for urban guerrilla warfare, a point which Pontecorvo wasn't unsympathetic to. In his words, quote, "Perhaps he is right, but that is much too simple. The film champions everyone who is deprived of his rights and encourages him to fight for them, but it is an analogy for many situations, Vietnam for one," end quote. Whatever the case, the movie has had an impact that's been long felt for decades and will likely continue to be felt. 1948's The Snake Pit, directed by Anatoly Litvak and based on Mary Jane Ward's 1946 novel of the same name, is about a woman who, going through a lot, experiences even more when she ends up in a mental institution. The title, The Snake Pit, is a reference to a ward within the institution. Patients that function well are in level 1, which is a bit more relaxed. But after a jealous nurse doesn't like the level of attention that she's getting from a doctor, she gets slapped with a straitjacket and sent to the Snake Pit, which is for those patients that are beyond help. The movie and book lay bare the fact that in any institution you're subject to the mercies of those that you're entrusted to. The problem is that the people that need to be in these kinds of institutions are also the least equipped to enact change if something is amiss. The go-to charge against such a patient would be that they're crazy, and people would buy it. Why? Because if they weren't, they wouldn't be in an asylum. The 19th century saw a rise in asylums in industrialized nations, starting in Britain and eventually finding its way across the pond in the US. Problems were apparent from the get-go. One big one was wrongful commitment. Maybe you're a woman, maybe you're married, and maybe you get into an argument with your husband over, I don't know, the color of the wallpaper. Maybe it's yellow, and maybe you don't like yellow. There was a non-zero chance that if you were such a woman in Victorian London or in the US, your husband or your father could have you committed to an asylum and you would have no recourse. Some women were lucky, if you can call it that. Elizabeth Packard, an American, was forcibly committed for 3 years by her husband, Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister. The relationship started to fray after Elizabeth Packard questioned her husband's strict Calvinist beliefs. The Packard husband was also pro-slavery, while Elizabeth Packard was not, and she would defend the devout abolitionist and American patriot John Brown. Eventually, Packard would have her forcibly committed. By that, I mean the country sheriff literally kidnapped her and transported her against her will to an asylum where she lost 3 years of life, and where they tried to get her to believe her husband's notions of religion. After her discharge, she was locked in her own home, with the windows nailed shut. She was able to get a letter to her friend Sarah Haslett, who got it to a judge who issued a writ of habeas corpus, meaning that she had to be brought to the judge's chambers. The judge would schedule a jury trial, Packard versus Packard. The trial lasted 5 days. The husband's lawyers had witnesses who testified that Elizabeth argued with her husband and even tried to leave the congregation. They thought that this was insanity, but they were also all from the same congregation. Elizabeth's lawyers called people that weren't from the same congregation, and they all said that they had never seen an act of insanity from her. Dr. Duncanson, a physician and theologian, also called by her lawyers, would say, quote, "I do not call people insane because they differ with me. I pronounce her a sane woman and wish we had a nation of such women," end quote. After 7 minutes of deliberation, the jury pronounced her legally sane. She was lucky that she got out. Many wouldn't, and the snake pit would help shed a light on the issues that people faced while there. By the 20th century, as funding decreased, asylums would become known for terrible living conditions and hygiene, overcrowding, incompetent and pseudoscientific treatment, and outright abuse. Multiple states began introducing reforms after the film was released, with Herb Stein writing for Variety, noting that, quote, "Wisconsin is the 7th state to institute reforms in its mental hospitals as a result of the snake pit," end quote. It also likely contributed to the deinstitutionalization movement that started picking up steam in the 50s. There are some people that think mental asylums should make a comeback, that perhaps mass involuntary hospitalization is the answer to not just the homeless epidemic, but perhaps for the addicted as well, those who can't quit the drink, the opiates, whatever. But like Einstein never said, quote, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results," end quote. Despite what the name might imply, the China Syndrome is not a xenophobic film. It's about nuclear power, and the titular China Syndrome is more of a notion that, in the case of a nuclear reactor meltdown, the melting components would melt through the earth all the way to China. The fact that this movie made it on this list is more of a result of luck and horribly good timing than anything else. It came out just 12 days before the 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania. 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station, sometimes called TMI, was a nuclear power plant that suffered a partial meltdown on March 28, 1979. Despite no deaths related to it, it did end up stoking fears about nuclear power on American soil. The movie, directed by James Bridges and starring Jane Fonda, Jack Lemmon, and Michael Douglas, is about a reporter and cameraman that stumble upon a near meltdown of a plant. As they try to get the truth out about what almost happened, corporate and government interests conspire to stop them, while the shift supervisor, played by Lemmon, tries to do the right thing but is overridden by the profit motive. The movie highlighted important shortfalls that are apparent in any organization, irrespective of its potential for catastrophic damage, such as inadequate safety measures, an overriding profit motive, and others. When the movie came out, the nuclear power industry, as well as its lobbyists, said that such an accident was unlikely and that the movie was alarmist. John Taylor, an executive at Westinghouse, which made nuclear reactors, called it, quote, "an overall character assassination of an entire industry," end quote. Meanwhile, Daniel Ford, a nuclear critic, said, quote, "The film highlights the central problem with the nuclear program. Safety precautions are being compromised by an industry whose major concerns are power generation and money-making," end quote. Any criticism of the movie was rendered somewhat moot when, less than 2 weeks later, TMI had its partial meltdown. It was one hell of a coincidence, one that did terminal damage to the nuclear industry in the United States. Ever since the bomb was developed, the first thing that comes to people's mind isn't safety or energy, it's catastrophe, irrespective of how remote the possibility actually is. The movie, commingled with the accident, led to increased scrutiny of power plants and halted the construction of new facilities. For a minute, it seemed as though the nuclear power industry had a golden path. The 1970s energy crisis highlighted the importance of energy independence and that we couldn't always rely on fossil fuels. Nuclear power was a clean, homegrown source of energy, but the accident and the movie made it political poison. No one wanted to be at ground zero for a nuclear reactor meltdown. That wasn't the entire impact of the movie, though. The corporate and governmental censorship of whistleblowers, especially in post-Watergate era, resonated with audiences who were increasingly skeptical of large institutions. Those enmities have only gotten stronger over the years. After the movie's release and the incident at TMI, nuclear power plants that had been under construction were completed, but no new ones were authorized between 1979 and 2013. 1932's I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang was directed by Mervyn LeRoy and starred Paul Mooney. It's about the real experiences of Robert E. Burns, a veteran falsely accused of robbery and sentenced to a southern chain gang. The movie depicted forced labor, inhumane prison conditions, and laid bare a system that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation. Coming out in the midst of the Great Depression, the movie got a lot of play. After all, movies were some of the cheapest sources of entertainment that you can find in those days. Chain gangs were groups of prisoners that were chained together as they worked, and they were prevalent in the South. The movie led to national outrage over inhumane treatment of prisoners. Under such direct heat, both figurative and literal, states began to reform or eliminate chain gangs altogether, replacing them with more regulated prison labor programs. It was an early example of a socially conscious film and proved that movies could serve as a catalyst for actual change. Movies could expose injustices and push for reform, and the best are able to do so in a humane manner. Sometimes the film is subtle, other times it's not. There's a worthwhile discussion to have about heavy-handedness in movie, though I'll only touch upon it here for now. Jeremiah Kipp, writing for Slant, said that the movie, quote, feels more like an uncompromising prison film than a message movie, so its frequent heavy-handedness seems more like unabashed pulp rather than sanctimony, end quote. That heavy-handedness would not only bring about real reform, but it helped Burns and other prisoners appeal their sentences in a more sympathetic environment and find freedom. Entertainment doesn't have to remain as entertainment. It can have a wide-ranging impact. Great movies, like great books, great video games, great art, and great music spur conversation. They get you thinking about the world and how it works. Perhaps there's something going on in the world right now that you don't like. Pick up a camera or pick up your phone and make something about it. It doesn't even need to be a documentary. These are all narrative films after all. With a little bit of thought and a lot of elbow grease, I see no reason why you can't make a movie that changes how we all think about the world.